Well, by now, the House of Representatives will have issued articles of impeachment and voted on them to impeach Donald J. Trump, the 45th president of the United States, and they say chief instigator of the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And we'll be waiting to see if the Senate will find Trump guilty, which is required to remove him from office, all with just 10 days left in his abominable single term of presidency. Now, what many people may not realize is that impeachment and removal from office carries lasting penalties like forfeiting the lifetime pension of $200,000 a year, the lifetime travel allowance, which is said to be around $1 million, the lifetime full Secret Service detail that we don't even know how much that costs over the years, and the ability to run for president again in the future. But the president has to be removed from office. He has to be convicted by the Senate and removed to be stripped of these benefits. If he is impeached but not removed, he stays on the dime of the people for the rest of his miserable life. So sure, this is a great incentive to not just impeach Trump, but to remove him, because why would the people of this country be forced to have our money pay for the man who inspired the violent assault by his fascist cult on the U.S. Capitol? That ought to be a fiscally responsible reason for conservatives to support this, but we'll see what the Senate does. But it's funny that when I ask that question, I realize that our money's paying for every other president who's unleashed fascist forces on us regular folks who don't live in the U.S. Capitol, and they've done it for years. Tell me, how was Barack Obama's violent crushing of the Occupy Wall Street movement not an expression of fascism when the corporate state got tired of those granola-eating leftists trying to educate and mobilize the 99% against the 1% that was and still is stealing our livelihoods and our futures as they bought politicians who passed legislation allowing them to underpay us, cut our benefits, eliminate our pensions, and more so they could hoard the profits that we made for them and then get the same politicians to pass laws to punish us for speaking out against that and protesting about it. How was his violent response to the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, Cleveland, Ohio, Sanford, Florida, and other cities across the country in response to the continued police and white supremacist vigilante murders of unarmed Black and brown people not fascism? How was Obama's overseeing of the expansion of the 1033 program that provided military equipment to the very same law enforcement apparatus that violently suppressed the freedom of the undesirable segments of society, not a signal to them to go ahead and crack down on the expression of dissent, and not just dissent, but betrayal and anguish and rage from those people over the way they were violated at every level of society? Media headlines talk about how dark a day Wednesday was in America because the U.S. Capitol was stormed by settler colonists angry that they didn't get their way in this election, and many of them displayed fascist iconography and expressed a devotion to Trump that looks a lot like the European fascists in the newsreels from World War I. But we've been trying to tell America that some of us have been living under fascism from this government long before this particular carnival barker president came along. But who would listen? We don't live at the U.S. Capitol, so our struggles under this government's fascism wasn't important. I mean, we probably deserved it if we just obeyed, right? And we're upset about an insurrection committed at the U.S. Capitol, but what are we going to do about the insurrections and the outright coups that the U.S. incites, funds, and carries out in countries around the world? Leaders that the people in those countries choose, but that the corporate state in this country wants removed because those elected officials will not allow the U.S. to come in and pillage their resources for the gain of the U.S. corporate state. So what are we going to do about the overthrow and violent assassination of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya under Obama, the execution of Saddam Hussein under George W. Bush? Those deadly insurrections and ultimate coups not important? Did you know that there's a video floating around social media of the QAnon shaman Buffalo Man telling the Venezuelan people that they too can rise up against their tyranny like the Trump supporters are rising up? Did you see that? Now, as much as I'm not going to agree with that guy in particular and these people in general, do we really want to lay the responsibility for the belief that the Venezuelan government is illegitimate at the feet of Donald Trump, who probably couldn't find it on a map without help, when every administration before Trump has tried to destroy the Bolivarian Revolution and overthrow both Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, for years? We're upset about an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol by Trump's fascist mob, but Democrats and Republicans invited an insurrectionist against Venezuela into the U.S. Capitol the night of the State of the Union address and gave him a standing ovation, Republicans and Democrats. And speaking of a fascist mob, is anybody else angry that Joseph R. Biden is about to nominate Victoria Nuland as the Undersecretary of State? Victoria Nuland, who went to Ukraine as Assistant Secretary of State under, guess who, Barack Obama, and gave out cookies to, she really did, and took smiling pictures with fascists in the United States efforts in supporting the fascist insurrection that overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian government that is now full of those fascists that the U.S. coordinated with, funded, and armed to do it. So seriously, do words like insurrection and fascism only bother us when we can use them to express horror at what's done against our allegedly sacred symbols of so-called democracy on Capitol Hill? Or are the insurrections that both political parties support, sponsor, and fund against regular folks in this country and the fascism against the governments and other countries not an issue? You want to impeach Trump for the former, fine, go ahead. But you don't think there's an issue with the latter that led to this moment? And the people responsible for that not only go free of any and all accountability, but they're treated as heroes now because they challenge the reality show host boogeyman who scares you. Meanwhile, we in the streets and people around the world are still afraid of all of the people who came before Trump, who will still be here to support insurrection and fascism against us after he's gone. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.